20 years ago, on November 19th, 1997, the final episode of Dragon Ball GT aired on Fuji TV, marking the end of a historic over 10-year run of Dragon Ball on television in Japan. And interestingly enough, outside of the video games, we would not be blessed with a new Dragon Ball animation until, well, over 10 years after GT's cancellation. So no matter what, the end of GT was the end of an era. And it's amazing but not surprising to me that ever since the end of GT, there has been so much misinformation and so many lies spread about what GT was, how it was created, how it ended, why it ended, Toriyama's involvement, and so much more misinformation about the series that it's mind-boggling. So, as we look back on 20 years of GT's cancellation and the end of the original run of the Dragon Ball anime, on this edition of Dragon Ball In Depth, my series where I dig deep into the roots and the secrets of Dragon Ball, we're going to discuss GT. This video is not about whether or not you like or dislike GT. That's not what we're doing with this video. Instead, I'm going to give you the entire true story of the rise and the fall of Dragon Ball GT with a plethora of new information that I have unearthed that the entire fandom needs to be aware of when discussing Dragon Ball GT. We're going to hit you with some big revelations on this video that many folks had no idea about, and hopefully destroy many of the pieces of misinformation that have plagued this series. So no matter what your opinion is of Dragon Ball GT, after watching this edition of In Depth, I assure you, you're going to know a lot more about it. So strap yourself in and get ready for the ride, and like the intro to GT says, hold my hand.
この放送はご覧のスポンサーの提供でお送りします。
Unlike most of Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball GT was not adapted from Akira Toriyama's manga, but ironically enough, the story of GT begins with the manga. Everything goes back to manga. On May 23rd, 1995, after 11 years of being in publication, Akira Toriyama's original Dragon Ball manga came to an end with the final chapter, which featured a 10-year time skip from the defeat of Majin Buu, where Goku and Oob, the reincarnation of Majin Buu, would meet up and would fly off together, and that would be the end of the story of Dragon Ball. This event was culturally significant, not just for Dragon Ball, but for Japan. Toriyama had been writing manga pretty much non-stop since the late 70s, and that's in addition to working on video games and other projects. He had been writing Dragon Ball and Dr. Slump non-stop, and the man needed a break, and thus he chose to end his super popular Dragon Ball manga here. One of the biggest loads of crap in this fandom that I've seen is people actually saying that Toriyama created the character of Oob and Pan and Bra in the manga for GT. That's complete nonsense. Dragon Ball GT would not even be an idea until several months later and would not premiere on television until February 7th, 1996. Those characters were created by Toriyama to end the manga, and he had no plans of continuing the story at the time. However, the issue was that Dragon Ball had become such a huge hit at the time and maintained its popularity for 10 years that the staff from Toei, Fuji TV, Bandai, they all wanted the Dragon Ball anime to continue in that golden time slot of 7 p.m. on Wednesday nights, even after the manga ended serialization. So sometime in the fall, the producers of the anime knew that the Dragon Ball Z portion of the story was almost over, and they pitched the idea to Toriyama himself and the editorial staff over at Weekly Shonen Jump about creating a new anime that would be set during the 10-year time skip in between the fight with Buu and the end of Z, featuring the next generation of characters. That's right, Dragon Ball GT was originally pitched to be set where Dragon Ball Super is set now. But after some debate, it was decided by Toriyama and the staff at Jump Magazine to set it after the final chapter of the original manga, and thus the production on Dragon Ball GT began. However, this time, the staff at Toei did not have a manga to adapt into an anime, so they had no original story, so they had to create a story, and this time there would be various different players involved in the creation of this story. Series director Osamu Kasai, Aya Matsui, writer Atsushi Maekawa, and of course, Kozo Morishita. But in the early days of Dragon Ball GT, Toriyama was absolutely involved in those meetings. If anybody tells you that Toriyama had no involvement in GT, they don't know what they're talking about. Because not only did Toriyama come up with the name Dragon Ball GT, which stood for Grand Touring or Grand Tour, Toriyama of course being a huge car enthusiast, but not only that, he also designed all of the initial character designs for Dragon Ball GT, including Vegeta's mustache, which ironically enough, it was Toriyama's daughter who made the suggestion to Toei to shave Vegeta's mustache later on in the series. That was covered in Daizenshu 7, but Toriyama also designed some of the early planets that Toei had come up with for the adventures of Goku, Pan, and Trunks. In a 2005 interview with Kozo Morishita, he talks about the early meetings with Toriyama about GT, where the Toei staff would give Toriyama plot outlines and he would check them off if he liked them and he would approve of them. So, those who think that Toriyama had no involvement in GT, Toriyama approved the initial story of Dragon Ball GT. In the Dragon Ball GT Dragon Boxes, there were interviews with Atsushi Maekawa and Kozo Morishita where they both discussed the early days of GT, and they talk about the idea behind turning Goku into a kid again, which was Toei's idea, as well as centering the series around Goku, Pan, and Trunks. This, of course, would be to mirror the roots of what Dragon Ball was originally, with Pan taking over the Bulma role and Trunks kind of taking over the Yamcha role just to have another fighter there. Turning Goku into a kid again was done for two reasons. Number one, because they wanted to give familiarity to Goku of how he used to be in the beginning of the series, and number two, because the anime staff felt that at this point in the series, Goku had grown far too strong and they had to figure out a clever way to, well, make him weaker. So yes, there was actually a power scaling reason as to why Goku was made into a kid again. Of course, the other big reason is because they knew that having a child protagonist would always draw in the kids. There's a reason why in Dragon Ball, every time that they have a kid grow up, a new kid takes over. Goku grew up, they introduced Gohan. Gohan grew up, Goku was dead in the Buu arc, they introduced Goten and Trunks. It's always been strategic storytelling in Japan to focus stories around young boys, shonen, anime, and manga. And that's why you always see people who are younger kind of get in the spotlight for a little while. That's why Goku became a kid again. And Toriyama was a-okay with it. Kozo Morishita also states that in the initial meetings, they wanted to focus the story around the next generation of fighters, like Oob, Goten, Trunks, and Pan, but by the time the series was moving, it was determined by the creative team to keep the story focused on Goku, because the story of Dragon Ball is the story of the life of Goku. That's at least their perspective. Now, many years later, in an interview, Toriyama stated that he felt that Dragon Ball GT was a grand side story, and many people took that quote as Toriyama essentially erasing GT from any sort of continuity and saying that, well, it doesn't really matter, it's not my vision, let's just watch it together and enjoy it, which is pretty much what he said. But what you have to understand is that back in 1996, when this show was first being planned, this was the legitimate anime-only continuation of Dragon Ball. Before any of the stuff that we have now, GT was the sequel to Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z without question. That's how it was perceived, that's how it was produced. Now we have a different situation. In fact, in the December issue of Jump magazine of 1995, Toriyama unveiled his design for Gil/Gidu of GT. It was his design, and 2 months later in the February 96 issue, which was published just a few weeks after Dragon Ball GT premiered on television, Toriyama would make history, and many people in this fandom, in fact the vast majority, have no idea how significant this is. Now, in this magazine, Toriyama talks very candidly about the end of the manga and about the anime-only continuation of GT, saying that he's looking forward to seeing where the story's going to go. And he says that in his mind, Dragon Ball had been over already for several months, but because of the staff and all the fans of Dragon Ball, it would continue in anime form. This issue of Jump Magazine was so historic because it would be the last time that Toriyama would draw Goku from his pen for years. And it was Kid Goku from GT. So this was Toriyama's goodbye after putting in so much time to the series. Let's be real. We don't exactly know why Toriyama ended Dragon Ball when he did, but the one theory that makes the most sense based on interviews, based on his schedule during the time, and based on, you know, just the way the manga was running, is that Toriyama was burnt out. Like I said earlier, the dude had been writing manga non-stop since the late 70s, and he needed a break, and he was already a millionaire for many, many years, so it wasn't about the money. The story was finished, and he just handed it off to Toei to keep the Dragon Ball spirit going with Dragon Ball GT. And thus, on February 7th, 1996, Dragon Ball GT began airing on Fuji TV, and there were several production changes that were made to GT to differ itself from Dragon Ball Z. Katsuyoshi Nakatsuru became the character designer for the series, taking over from Tadayoshi Yamamuro, and Akihito Tokunaga was brought in as the new series composer to take over Kikuchi. And of course, the series was written by the Toei staff, not by Toriyama, but it was approved by him for those early episodes. Dragon Ball GT would run for 64 episodes until it ended November 19th, 1997, but Dragon Ball GT was not originally supposed to be 64 episodes. It was presumably supposed to be even longer than that, but in the summer of 1997, Dragon Ball GT was cancelled, and the end of the series was wrapped up. They came up with an ending, they finished off the arc of the Shadow Dragons, and that would be the end of Dragon Ball for several years. But the question is why? Why did Dragon Ball GT get canceled? Was Dragon Ball GT not popular? Did the ratings go down? Was the lack of Toriyama involvement the reason why it went down? What was the real reason GT was canceled? We'll get to that next. The common reason that's cited by many fans as to why Dragon Ball GT was canceled is that the series just wasn't popular and the ratings had declined. That's what many of us were told for many years, but when you do a lot of deeper digging and a lot more research into what was going on back then in Japan, you come to find some very interesting revelations that kind of disprove that being the case. The highest rated episode of Dragon Ball GT was episode 2. It did a 19.7 rating, and the lowest rated episode was episode 21. It did a 9.6. Now, one could sit there and they could ponder as to what happened here, and the biggest theory is that fans who tuned into GT did not want to see Goku become a kid again. They weren't interested in that storyline. They weren't interested in the space adventures, and they just didn't care about the initial storylines of Dragon Ball GT. And what I find really interesting about that is in the interview with Kozo Morishita, he confirms that even those on staff thought that it was a bit underwhelming. Morishita says that they originally made 26 episodes worth of plot outlines, but right when they got done with the final script for episode 3, they realized that the travel episodes are not going to be that interesting no matter how long they keep doing them, so they had to quickly figure out that they had to shift the series into being a little bit more like Dragon Ball Z, which is when they introduced the machine mutants and Baby and the characters that would be, you know, the villains for the series. And they also had Katsuyoshi Nakatsuru design a brand new transformation for Goku, and that would of course become Super Saiyan 4. That's right, Toriyama did not design this, Nakatsuru did, with the idea being that they would make him into an adult again temporarily to showcase the maximum power he had achieved in this form. They wanted to emphasize his strength. This was an idea from Atsushi Maekawa. Now, what I find interesting about the Morishita interview is that he talks about those early episodes not being that exciting, which was Ironically enough, the talk of the Dragon Ball fandom way back in the late 90s, both in the Japanese and American side of the fandom. Many folks back then on the internet in the early days of message boards were discussing how those early GT episodes were boring to them. And this opinion about those early GT episodes was so influential that Funimation caught wind of it, which is why when they would go on to dub Dragon Ball GT, they would actually release the episodes out of order. They skipped the first 16 episodes of GT, and instead they included a brand new edited recap episode called A Grand Problem, which would recap the first 16 episodes of GT, because they thought that if fans started with episode 1, they would be bored from the get-go, so they started with episode 17. This was crazy. Later on, they would go back and re-release the first 16 episodes as Dragon Ball GT The Lost Episodes, because even Funimation themselves feared that people would not be interested in GT. But is that what happened in Japan? Well, there are a few factors that we have to look at here to examine what actually happened to GT. The first thing you have to understand is that the idea of Dragon Ball GT's ratings going down is kind of a myth. When you look at the ratings for Dragon Ball GT from start to finish, they fluctuate. They go up, they go down, they went back up again. Were the ratings close to Dragon Ball Z? Absolutely not. But if you look back at the history of the entire franchise, and not just the ratings patterns, but also the manga sales, the decline in popularity of Dragon Ball did not begin in GT. It started in the Buu arc, right around Dragon Ball Z episode 218, which is the highest rated episode of DBZ. After that, it was all downhill from there. There was an upward trend in the Cell Saga, probably because of how popular Gohan had become, to where people were interested in the stories past the Cell Saga. But at some point in the Buu arc, Japanese fans checked out. In terms of manga popularity, the most popular time during the Z portion of the run was the Frieza Saga. For the anime, it was the Cell Saga. But with both of them, the Buu arc began to decline slowly. People still watched it, they read it, but it wasn't quite the same. So the series had already been on the way down before GT even began. There's one key thing that you're probably wondering. Why do you keep bringing up manga? If there's one thing that I want fans outside of Japan to understand about Dragon Ball, it's that Japan is not like everywhere else, and there are several cultural differences between them and us. Case in point, the importance of manga. You have to understand that in Japan, manga is significantly more culturally important and mainstreamly accepted than even anime in some cases, especially back in 1997. The success of an anime is not predicated specifically on ratings. Same thing goes for Dragon Ball Super. It's a combination of merchandise sales, and if there's a manga sales as well. Well, with Dragon Ball GT, there was no manga counterpart, and that probably did make a difference as far as the popularity of GT at the time. It really is a combination of merchandise sales and sponsorships. If Bandai's making money, Toei's making money, Shueisha's making money. All the companies have to be together with synergy for a series to be successful. And with GT, they did not have that same synergy that they had with Dragon Ball and with Dragon Ball Z. You have to always remember, especially back in 1997, before all this technology that we have today, that manga was the centerpiece of Japanese entertainment. Manga is where everything started, and everything else is just extra. Movies, anime, manga is the core form of entertainment in Japan. Well, how about this one for a shocker? Right around the end of Dragon Ball, it would not be the only major series to come to an end. Dragon Ball, Yu Yu Hakusho, and Slam Dunk, three of the biggest manga of the 90s, which sold millions, all came to an end right around the same time. And as a result of three very popular shonen manga coming to an end, Jump magazine went into a business slump, and it wasn't until the popularity of One Piece that Jump would come back into prominence several years later. One Piece began in 97, but it really didn't pick up steam until a few years later. But with the end of those three series, the manga industry was in deep trouble for a few years there, and that heavily contributed to Dragon Ball's lack of interest during this time. So when you take the information that I've gathered here, the manga collapse, the ratings decline in the Buu saga, Toriyama hanging it up, what was the real reason Dragon Ball GT came to an end? Was it because the series itself was bad? Maybe. Maybe. You have to ask the people of Japan their individual opinions. The real reason why Dragon Ball GT did not last as long as they wanted it to is because of a simple phrase called franchise fatigue. Dragon Ball had been on the air non-stop from 1986 to 1997. There were no seasonal breaks in Japan. You got a new episode every single week. And unfortunately, no matter how much you love Dragon Ball, a lot of people needed a break. It was constant. You had manga, you had movies, you had video games, you had all this different Dragon Ball stuff everywhere. And some people either grew out of it, they went to college, they had children. You know, life kind of took its toll, and Father Time basically shut Dragon Ball out for at least a decade until we had the big Dragon Ball renaissance, starting with the Yo Son Goku special in 2008 into Battle of Gods and now Super. The reality is Dragon Ball needed to take a little break. There are other shows in Japan that have aired for decades non-stop, like Doraemon and Sazai, but those aren't Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball just needed a break, and this was the time to give it to it. Morishita in his interview talks about how the fandom back then was very divided. Some people enjoyed the anything goes attitude of Dragon Ball GT, while other fans were like, well, you're ruining the original. You're not making it as interesting as Toriyama made it. So it was very split down the middle. The bottom line is that regardless of your opinion of GT and whether you like it or hate it, the popularity of GT was nowhere close to that of Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, and franchise fatigue was the main reason as to why GT would be the end of the series, and it all started in the Buu arc. People were already tuning out back then, even before GT began, and thus GT was sort of like the final nail in the coffin. But compared to other anime, GT was still pretty much a hit. It was just other factors outside of the anime ratings that really factored into GT coming to an end. The decision was made from Fuji TV and Toei to end Dragon Ball GT, and thus the anime staff went ahead and completed the story of the life of Goku, with him disappearing for 100 years and coming back in the far future. October 23rd, 1997 would be a very historic and emotional day, as that was the day that the final GT episode was recorded by the voice actors, and it would premiere just a month later and put an end to Dragon Ball, and what a ride it was. The question, of course, on many people's minds is, where would GT have gone? We had the Goku Jr. TV special airing after Dragon Ball GT episode 41, which established Goku Jr. as a possible future character for the series. Unfortunately, there is no information about where the story would have actually gone, as they were writing it pretty much on the fly. But Dragon Ball would return to television in 2009, celebrating the 20-year anniversary of the start of Dragon Ball Z with Dragon Ball Kai. I hope you enjoyed this look back at Dragon Ball GT, and I hope that we clarified a lot of the misconceptions about the series, and you learned something new about the production of the series, and how even back then it was intended to be an anime-only continuation, but now it's just kind of a branch, a different continuity, a what-if scenario, if you will. But it's still one that I think should be watched again, because if you've never seen GT, give it a try. You might actually like it. It does have a lot of problems, I'm not going to lie about that, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of fun moments in it and a lot of cool fights as well, and that's really what Dragon Ball is all about. I want to thank Herms. I worked hand in hand with him doing extensive research for this video, and I hope you guys have a great day, and I will catch you down that long and winding road.